I'm Garrett McQueen.
I'm Scott Blankenship.
And this is TRILLOQUY, true and real stories from the fringes of classical music, coming right out of a little frustration right out of the gate, because sometimes technology doesn't exactly do what you need it to do, does it?
Sometimes,
Yeah,
most of the time.
But anyway, some folks that do exactly what they should, at least most of the time, some of the time, are all of the arts administrators of the world. And we're actually going to I talked with a arts administrator named Quanice Floyd, and that is today's interview portion of TRILLOQUY. Do you know much about the field of arts administration?
They do everything important, really.
They would certainly like for you to say that.
Well, they're doing all the behind the scenes stuff. They're doing contract negotiations. They're producing. They're doing getting your volunteers organized,
setting up the chairs and the stands at the rehearsals, doing a bit of it all, but very important work.
Yeah, they make it happen.
Yeah, and another thing that the arts administrators do is take care of the social media for whatever orchestras and whatever.
That's a new thing, right? That's like a more recent thing.
Well, a lot of these institutions are trying to jump in and be as equitable as they can and be as far-reaching as they can, and social media is certainly a way to do that. And Scott, I had a little run-in.
Do tell.
So I spend a lot of time on Twitter because I think it's important to, especially when I'm on the air overnight, because that's when I'm, forward promoting. I'm like, hey, if y'all want to hear this, just click this link or whatever.
I hadn't thought about promoting that way.
And that's how I that's how I get a lot of followers and get a lot of listeners and feedback and all that stuff.
Nice.
So anyway, I spent a lot of time on Twitter, and I noticed that the London Philharmonic had tweeted out this photo, and a lot of people are doing it. So it's a picture of a lunchroom, and at different tables in this case, were different composers. And they asked the question, well, what lunch table are you sitting at? Who are you sitting with? And none of the composers that they had put in the lunchroom were, I almost want to say there were a couple Americans, but there certainly were no composers of color.
And didn't Corelli get in there twice?
Corelli getting there. He's at two different lunch tables. And so I tweeted them back. I said, I guess the black composers had to they had to eat outside, huh?
Damn.
And boy, that caught fire. I mean, I think as I speak now, I'm up to like 60,000 or 70,000 engagements.
What?
It got big. So
I get a dozen likes on Facebook, and I'm like, ooh, man, I'm blowing up.
Well, obviously the London Philharmonic saw that, and they, the next day they tweeted out this long extended feature about Florence Price to kind of, sort of make up for it, which, the arts administrators and the social media position for that orchestra should be more aware of black classical music, especially these days.
Sure.
But they responded in a really great way, and I appreciated that. Now, the same night, I noticed that Scott, our hometown orchestra, they did something similar in some of the rollouts for their upcoming season, and I called it out on Twitter. And someone from that organization decided to try to get me in a little trouble. They called our higher ups here at 8 p.m. and that it pissed me off a little bit. But it's good to see that some orchestras, some folks in arts administration are willing to engage conversations equitably, and some are just want to respond by getting somebody in trouble. So I'll be sure to keep that in mind next time I want to go to a concert or someone asks me about my local orchestra. Maybe a donor or an artist or someone else is interested in a little collaboration. I'm going to keep all of that in mind next time someone comes through town and wants to engage me and wants me to engage classical music with them, specifically live classical music.
So
all shade, all disrespect.
How many impressions are you up to on that one?
That one, and that one wasn't as big. That one was more of a quieter sort of thing, but that got more of the reaction. So yeah, again, shout out to all of the arts administrators doing the good work, and shout out to those of you just trying to silence us. It's not going to work.
There was nothing incorrect about the statement that you made, though.
I didn't think so.
And let me say something that I noticed about it, because Devon Gray was talking about that very
Exactly.
thing. Okay,
Exactly.
so it's not like these conversations aren't happening. I think that you were kind of a lightning rod in that you have the position that you have, being on the air. And I noticed the exact same thing that you did, and I didn't feel courageous enough to make a social media stink about it.
Right, right, and even a few opuses back, and still we're talking about him, Nibal Masood and his ground shattering article. It's time for classical music to die. He even got involved with me on social media and engaging that conversation. And what it instantly made me think of is the sort of artistic colonization he talks about in that article that he wrote, and how some things are allowed into those spaces and some things aren't. And that idea of colonization plays a lot into what Quanice talks about this week. So on this opus of Triloquy. So she grew up in New York, currently lives in Washington D.C., which has been the victim of lots of quote unquote colonization. The word these days is gentrification, but it's very similar when you think about all of these neighborhoods that are starting to look a little bit different in Washington D.C. People getting pushed out. It's just another iteration of what happened so long ago to the indigenous populations of this place that we now call America. And one of the really great things Quanice does is every time she's in front of a microphone, she acknowledges the native people's land that she's currently occupying, and we do that at the beginning of the interview. So just in a few minutes, you'll get to hear. Um, you'll get to hear the indigenous people, a shout out to them whose land we occupy. I think it's important to acknowledge that as much as we can.
I think that this is a great time to bring focus to the fact that there are still Dakota Access Pipeline and Keystone Access Pipeline protests that are still happening
Absolutely.
along the northern border of Nebraska and the southern border of South Dakota. That's still going on. And there has been legislation introduced in the Dakotas to make protesting those pipelines illegal.
Isn't that just
Now, let me tell you, though, I mean, originally that pipeline was supposed to go near Bismarck, and that didn't happen.
no.
You know why? The residents of Bismarck are mostly white. They don't want that in their backyard.
Goodness gracious. And I can't help but to just tread so lightly because when you talk about the Dakotas, we say these indigenous words all the time, and
Yep.
and we're still ignoring those populations. You grew up in a place that sounds indigenous to me, Omaha,
Yep.
Nebraska.
Well, the Omaha Indian and Pakwa were there too, but they were really kind of grouped in with Pawnee. The Pawnee Indians
Okay.
were all through the Platte River Valley. So just think of, Omaha as being underneath Pawnee. It was
Yeah,
just sort of a
yeah.
part of
And you're using
Pawnee.
that I word, but I've seen I'm gonna say it now. I've seen the phrase Pawnee Indian in texts and literature that
Hmm.
I consider reputable. If there's if I shouldn't say that, I hope someone from one of those tribes will reach out and correct me. I hate the phrase Native American because they were native to their own land. They weren't native to America.
Yep.
The white man from Europe brought that over.
I wonder if First Nations is one that I've heard a lot,
First Nations, yeah,
or
or
just
indigenous people.
indigenous. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. What was that part of your? We're going to get to Quanies, but I just want to ask you quickly. Was that part of your upbringing to learn about those indigenous populations?
It was, especially in grade school and also in Omaha. The Joslin Art Museum has a deep connection to
Hmm.
indigenous art. It takes up a large portion of the museum.
I don't know if it's still there in Memphis, but one of the major field trips that kids took. I remember going to kindergarten, first grade, a few years in a row. Was It's either a replica of a tribe or one that's just been preserved, and the place is called Chucalissa.
Mm.
And if and Quanice is gonna give you a website where you can look up the indigenous peoples' lands that you occupy. And during our interview, I just went into my phone and just searched the zip code that I grew up in, and indeed, the Chucalissa tribe was a part of that land. So,
Mm,
yeah, shout out to all of the education initiatives out there to really engage that. Unfortunately, we don't engage it so much in classical music. And, I always made a point to, especially at my previous station on the Monday that folks call Columbus Day, I dedicated that to classical music with indigenous ties.
yeah.
And one of the main composers of that sort of music, his name is James DeMars. He features again, this phrase, but the Native American flute playing of a guy named R. Carlos Nakai. Really incredible music. And I thought we might just hear a small clip of it now.
Let's do.
Music there of composer James DeMars featuring the flute playing of R. Carlos Nakai. That's a tune called Colors Fall. So be sure to go look that up and listen to more of the music of James DeMars if you're interested in the connection and the relationship between classical music and the music of indigenous people, the the first peoples of this land we call North America. So, yeah, with all that in mind, let's go ahead and pop into the conversation between myself and Quanice Floyd, an arts administrator living over on the East Coast.
How do you start into this conversation?
Exactly the way I said. We first acknowledge the indigenous people's lands that we're occupying, and we just go from there. Quanice, it's so great to have you here. And before we start, I'd like to acknowledge the indigenous people's lands who I currently occupy, specifically the Dakota Sioux, the Mdewakanton, and the Ho-Chunk tribes. How about you? Where are you right now?
So I'm located right now in the land of the Piscataway and the Anacostan here in Washington, D.C.
Why is that something you do? I first noticed you acknowledging indigenous people's lands when I went and saw a live recording of one of your podcasts. Where did that idea come from?
Joshua and I, who's the co-host of my podcast Art Accordingly, we went through a racial equity training for this organization called Art Equity. And so one of the things that we were learning about was how we often do not talk about indigenous lands and how the effects of colonialism to indigenous communities here within the United States. And so we wanted to pay homage to those who were here prior to America being America. And we wanted to respect those lands and honor those ancestors who were here, who have created uh, communities and built love and passion and opportunity here before the sack and pillage of indigenous communities here in the United States. So we wanted to make sure that we were honoring them and that everyone knew where exactly we are every time we have a show. So no matter where we were, Joshua and I probably traveled to 6 different cities this year alone, and we just wanted everyone to understand that this is what was here before America was America, and these were the tribes that were here. This was the nation that was here prior to the colonialism that's happened.
And twice you used the phrase "before America was America," and that's sort of why I prefer the phrase indigenous people. I don't really like the idea of Native Americans because, again, they're native to their own lands. They aren't native to the land that we call America, or that the colonizers called America, or whoever, right?
Right.
Listening to one of my favorite podcasts, the Joe Budden podcast, they kind of talked about the history of the Hudson River, and you're originally a New Yorker, right?
Right.
So
Yeah.
so they talked about how this guy named Henry Hudson was going along the river, and he was noticing how the indigenous people there were he thought they were pillaging or destroying. They were burning the lands because that's a part of their agriculture process. But he in turn went back and destroyed them all. And
Mm,
now we have the Hudson River named after
right.
this guy. And that's just one of the many stories of indigenous people that we just sort of ignore. And
Hmm.
the celebrated part of it are the people who destroyed their communities. I mean,
Right.
from your perspective, what do we need to do to sort of unearth some of these stories and to fix this history? No one's renaming the Hudson River anytime soon, but surely there are other things we can do, right?
Right. Yeah, and I think a part of acknowledging the land that we're on is doing research on the history of the land and learning about those communities that were there prior to America, and reaching out to those communities, asking what their needs are, letting their voices be amplified so that people know that these communities actually still exist. They have different tribal websites that you can look at. You can talk to the nations, like the leaders of their specific nations and tribes. You can have conversations with them and see how you can better support their community. So I think it's really important for people to understand like the history of everything, but as well as how they can help amplify. Because I don't want to speak for
Of
any
course.
indigenous community and how we can better help them, but just reach out to them because they. To be honest, if every time you go on native-land.ca, you can legally, literally click on the link to their nation and their tribe, and you can connect with them. So I think this is a really awesome website that's gotten really popular over the past probably 2 years or so. But so I would highly recommend anybody who's listening to go to native-land.ca and then type in their zip code, and then they can see what indigenous nations have been where they currently reside.
Now, this level of cultural competency you currently practice, is this something that existed in your own upbringing, in your own music education growing up in New York?
So that's a very good question. Growing up in New York was a little bit different. We did learn about like the history of Manhattan and how the indigenous nations who were living in Manhattan were manipulated into giving the European colonizers the island of Manhattan for like five. I think it was equivalent to like $5 today.
Wow.
Um, Right, right. And this was something that was a part of the history in elementary school. They would teach us, but they never really got into the depthness of the manipulation, right? They just would say, hey, they try, it was almost like a negative thing. Like these quote unquote dumb people, indigenous people gave up America for only five, gave up Manhattan for only $5. And now look at Manhattan. It's the financial district of the world. It's da
Right.
da da of the world. It's da da da. So they did it in a very they centered whiteness in that whole conversation the entire time. Like whiteness was the rightness, right?
Oh wow.
um, so as I grew up, my family had a lot of activity in our own like African American history.
Hmm.
They were participants in the Staten Island like Black Panther Party. So like a lot of those conversations that were circulated around Black and Brown people happened in my own household. Um, and I remember a lot of people were talking about, how you have the talk with your kids about
Yeah.
what it's like to be a Black or brown person and
Yeah.
your interactions with police and all that other stuff. But when I first started playing piano, I got interviewed for like this newspaper. I don't even know if this newspaper still exists because of the internet, but they interviewed me and I was like 6 or 7 years old, and they were like, "What do you want to be when you grow up?" And I said, "I want to be the first African American composer." And my
Hmm.
uncle was like, "Wait, hold up! Didn't you know Beethoven was black?" And I said, and I was like, "No, I didn't know that because, of course, my teacher wouldn't teach me that, right?" So, um, that was it was something that was incorporated like throughout um many I say many fabrics of my growing up, my history, where there was conversations about like what it's like to be a black person in this position, whether Beethoven was black, whether going to how music today is incorporated from like the sounds of polyrhythms from like Ghana and Western Africa and
Mm-hmm.
all of that, how all of that comes together. So that's definitely a lot of most of the stuff that I've learned from home and not from like private lessons and from, I went to a performing arts high school. We didn't learn about that in high school. Um, However, I went to Howard University for my undergrad and I got my degree in music education. And of course, it's required. You have to learn African American music, you have
Of
to learn
course.
African music, like you have to learn all of that. And so it kind of all the pieces started coming together when I was at Howard.
But before you got to Howard, like year, maybe even before attending the Performing Arts High School, where did this sort of love and appreciation for music come from? Were your parents musicians?
So, actually, nobody in my family was a musician.
But you knew
um,
at the age of 6 or 7 that you were interested in being a composer.
yeah, so I was very, very young. So I lost my mother when I was 4, and I think my family was trying to figure out things that I could push my energy into because they didn't quite know. As a young kid, you don't quite know what fit. So I had cousins who were in dance. I tried dance. That didn't work out for me. I was in karate. That worked for
Okay.
me. But then also my grand aunt Carrie. She loved piano. So her and my grandmother put their money together. They're older black women, old retired, fixed income,
Yeah.
and they put their money together and put me into private piano lessons. And then I remember my aunt saying, "Oh, I tried piano when I was your age, and I just didn't like it." So pretty much like every person in my family tried piano lessons, and they never liked it. And then I was the first one who I actually like stuck with.
Oh wow.
Um, and so here I am, 6 years old, and I'm like really enjoying like playing private lessons with my teacher. And she still has her conservatory open in Staten Island. It was the Staten Island Conservatory of Music, and I'm just like playing piano and they love it. Like my grandaunt, my grandmother, they loved it. Like she's the only one who knows how to play.
Uh huh.
Let her play. Let her play at Thanksgiving. Let her play at Christmas. Let her play. Like, they were very like encouraging, but I think it was because I took to it. And I was trying to figure out who I was as a individual because usually children don't lose their parents that young.
Right.
And so it was a little bit more difficult for me trying to figure out who I was, where I was. My mom's not here. My dad's not really around. So the fact that I was living with my grandmother and my aunt and my uncle, it was like, what exactly is her thing? How can we make sure that she doesn't go down the wrong path? Because we know what happens when, you don't have a mother and father in the home. We know what happens when teachers start labeling you because you're acting out in school because you don't have the mother and father in the home. So what can we do to change this story and this narrative around for this little black girl?
And then
Um,
putting you into a performing arts high school, was a part of that journey, I guess.
right. Yeah. And I actually, because I loved music so much, I pretty much played in middle school. I pretty much played in like all of the functions. I started playing violin in third grade. And so I was playing in like orchestra, jazz band, concert band. It was really interesting. And even if I wasn't playing like a concert band instrument, they would put me on like bassoon because they knew I could read bass clef and treble clef, and I would read the bassoon on the keyboard and change the sound to bassoon on the keyboard and play that in concert band.
Look at you
Like it
making it
was
work, making it make sense.
right, right. And so I was like, I really want to go to a performing arts high school, but I don't want to go to some like a big school. I was not a fan of big schools because I got overwhelmed and it was too much.
Sure.
So, all the students who want to go to performing arts schools always like apply for LaGuardia because that's like the biggest performing arts school in New York City. But LaGuardia had escalators. Like that's a huge school. Like that wasn't my cup of tea. Like I'm coming from Staten Island, which is it's a very small borough, but it's really intimate. Like Staten Island to me was more of like a very small community. And so for me to go to something as big as LaGuardia, I didn't feel connected to it. So I ended up going to a smaller school called Town Unlimited High School, which was the #2 performing arts school in New York City at the time.
Mm-hmm.
And we only had, I think I had 120 people in my graduating class. It was very small, but we knew everybody knew each other. So it was really a really unique, and then the school mostly was black and brown kids.
Yeah, yeah.
So it was a really unique experience compared to LaGuardia, where it's a lot of white and Asian kids.
And
Um,
when you mention the LaGuardia School of the Performing Arts, that is, I'm still thinking about our indigenous peoples conversation. That is representative of an indigenous people. The name LaGuardia,
right,
and we don't even think about it. Half
right,
the time. Wow, it's something for me to think about. It's like once your eyes are open to that sort of thing, you see so much more.
right.
But anyway, so LaGuardia was a little too big for you. You ended up at your performing arts high school, and as you mentioned, you went on to Howard University. Now, in the very first episode, the first opus of this podcast, I talked to someone who went to an HBCU, and I talked to him about the fact that I just was not. How can I say, I wasn't pathed or pushed toward an HBCU. I just didn't have the concept of going to one. Where did that come for you? Where did that come from for you?
Ooh, I think it came from many different factors. Like throughout my life, like I had such a strong structure in like African Americanism, I
Yeah,
guess
blackness. Yeah.
blackness in my own household. Plus, I went to like a high school that was full of black and brown kids, and then I just wanted to be around more black people. I don't know. It was a calling to me. I knew pretty much by the time I actually got to high school that I wanted to go to an HBCU. I didn't know which one I wanted to go to, but I knew I wanted to go to an HBCU. And so I went to I funny thing, I got a high school internship at Washington Mutual Bank, which doesn't even exist anymore because they
Hmm.
like folded in the recession.
Yeah.
But there was coworkers there, and we were working in the Upper East Side of Manhattan, which is right around the corner from my high school. And we were working, and one of my coworkers went to Dillard, and we were having different conversations, and he was like, well, why don't you try Dillard? I was like, I'm born and raised in New York. I don't want to go that far south. I don't know about all that.
Yeah, yeah.
So he's like, well, Howard is the number one HBCU, and it's a really good school, and it's not that far from New York. You can still, go to your family. You can still go here. I was like, well, I'll check into it. So I applied my senior year. I was an overachiever. I applied to like 25
Oh,
schools and
wow.
got into like 24. And
Were any of those
I
not HBCUs?
yes, so
Okay.
there were SUNYs, which are State University of New York,
Yep.
CUNYs, which are City University of New York. I knew I wasn't going to go there, but I just applied because that would make my family happy because they wanted me to stay in the city,
Sure.
or they said wanted me to stay in New York. And then I applied to like what's some other schools I did? Like University of the Arts in Philadelphia. Um, I can't even remember all those schools. It was a lot. But I remember when they posted like all of the people who were graduating in that year,
Hmm.
and they would put the different schools they got accepted to, and mine had like the longest.
I'm sure you were proud of that.
Yeah, so I was like, if Howard was like the last school that I applied to, and so I said that if I didn't get into Howard, I would go to Delaware State, which is another HBCU, which is like a really random HBCU. But I know my Delaware was fairly close to New York, and my aunt
Sure.
loved Delaware because she used to like going to the casinos down there, like go shopping
Okay.
because they ain't got no taxes. But I was like,
Okay.
okay, well, I'm waiting for Howard, so let's see. And then all of a sudden, I think it was like March or April. I didn't hear anything, and I had to go in for an audition and all that other stuff, but I didn't hear anything, so I ended up calling. They were like, "Yeah, you got accepted," but I didn't get no letter. And I was like, "Oh, okay. Can y'all send something,
Yeah.
please?" So they ended up sending me the letter, and then my family was like, "Yes, you're going to Howard." I was like, "Oh my goodness!" And it just felt like at that point when I got that acceptance, I felt like I had to go. There was no other place I could go but to Howard University.
Now, what do you say to the sort of misconception that you have to go to one of these conservatories or these fancy music schools to have a good start in music? It seems like there's this sort of misconception out there that HBCUs don't offer the same music education or the same music opportunities as the predominantly white institutions.
Right. I'm gonna tell people don't even listen to that because my experience at Howard, well, I would say it was comparable to conservatory. Like, not only were we learning the Western classical canon, we were learning like the African and like how that connects like the ethnomusicology of all of everything. And to me, that was like the best part of all of it. I love learning how music of different nations connected. I loved learning how to play music from different nations,
Yeah.
and understanding the theories and the applications and the concepts behind all of that. And I mean, I was in the practice room like literally like 6 hours a day. I would have class from 8 a.m. until about 4 p.m., be in the practice rooms until about 10 p.m., and then try to have a social life sometimes, maybe go to the club once in a
Okay.
while.
Yeah.
But it was really intense. It was probably one of the most intense experiences that I've had as a musician. And then it was really great connecting with other brilliant minds who were musicians around the nation at this one, HBCU at Howard. And most of the people I went to school now, they're like always a part of like the DC music circuit. Like they're always playing for different, like the DC Jazz Fest, and they're playing at Carnegie Hall, and they're playing behind like Chance the Rapper. Like
Oh,
people are
wow.
really like out there. And I don't, so the fact that people only limit like conservatory training to non HBCUs is like, it's ridiculous, because we could do that and more because we're learning outside of the Western canon at HBCUs. We're learning our music plus your music.
Right, right. And I have to say, I'm just so jealous of all of that because, learning about, our music and that setting just has to be so invaluable.
It
And,
is.
and wow, it just makes me shake my head. If I could go back, I definitely appreciate my musical upbringing, but there's definitely something to be said about a program that, focuses on, those sorts of cultural competencies and making sure that the students know their music, the music of their ancestors. Did
Right.
Now you said you went and majored at Howard University as a music ed major. Is that what you started out to do? Were you always planning on being a music teacher?
Yeah, so I when I was 9 years old, Mr. Holland's Opus might have like either just came out, or maybe it came out a couple of years before. And so I saw the movie and I was just like in love with the movie. I was in love with Mr. Holland uh, because of the work that he was doing with the students, both inside and outside of the classroom. He was like helping build them up to be like the global creative citizens and the best citizens that they could be for themselves and for the world around them. I remember that one scene where he was teaching the student who went into the army, and
Yeah,
then
yeah.
he ended up going to the army and passing away, and it was just so like I felt that, like, to me that was like, oh my goodness, you had this amazing connection to this student who was like, I didn't want to play drums, I hate this, and then he ended up loving playing drums, and then he went into the army, and then he was like playing drums in the army, and then like it was just fascinating to me.
Yeah,
So I
you
knew I
felt
always wanted to
that.
teach. Yeah, I did. So I knew I wanted to teach. um I always wanted to teach, and I really wanted to teach students who looked like me,
Yeah.
because in the public school setting, you don't get the opportunity to teach music from different worlds. If you don't get opportunities for students to learn about music from different worlds and incorporate that. And so, being a public school teacher, that's something that was like my mission. Like, sure, we can learn Danny Boy and how to play Danny Boy and Hot Cross Buns on the recorder, but like, can we learn about like what it is like to listen to music from Cuba, or music from Ghana, or music from Nigeria? Like, how does that, like, how can we incorporate what the students listen to at home with their families into the public school classroom?
So how did you do that in your classroom?
I just did it. Like, especially with my background at Howard, like we had a lot of training in non-Western music.
Yeah.
And so like just incorporating all of that. So for me, it was more about like sitting at home. I remember sitting at home one summer and I was just looking at like standards and the units that they already had, and incorporating like different music into each of these units. And I got in trouble for that. Honestly,
Really?
I could be very public with that. I got in trouble for that because it wasn't the norm. It wasn't when a assistant principal or a principal walk into your classroom, it's supposed to look like the other music classrooms, but mine didn't. Mine was more interactive. Students loved it. It had dancing, it had singing, it had composing and creating. Like students were writing their own music because now they understood these rhythms that were coming out of like the music that they listened to.
Right, right.
Um, at one point, I did a whole unit on protest music.
Oh, I bet that
Lord, they
really made
done,
him mad.
Lord, they done, that school system blew a gasket because you teaching kids about protest. I'm like, well, we teach students about the Revolutionary War,
Right.
and that's, that was a form of protest. So why can't we teach them the music behind all of this stuff? Why can't we teach them the music behind the civil rights movement? Why can't we teach them the music behind all of this? So it was really interesting the reactions that I was getting. It was almost like you're teaching them outside of the box, and we don't want them to know that. It's really fascinating. I was like, I got written up so many times.
Well, I mean, you got in actual official trouble.
I did. And then I was literally like showing them the curriculum and like saying, hey, you could find this, this, and this in this song. So why am I getting in trouble? Well, it's not in our recommended sources of music, our recommended references of music.
And see, and
So you're telling me just because the song is not in your list of songs that I can't teach the students the song, but the concepts are in the song. So it was just a really interesting battle that I was having with multiple administrators at that time
and
as to
that
what it looked like.
and that really just trips me out because when I think about DC, and maybe it's not so much the case anymore, but we used to call it Chocolate City,
Right,
and you describing yourself as someone who wanted to teach students that look like you, and you're
right,
teaching these black and brown kids, and you are even allowed to engage them in a culturally competent way. I mean,
right.
what people I get on people's nerves by always boiling everything down to race, but again, to me this sounds like white supremacy in the
In
classroom,
this
or
classroom, yep.
in the curriculums. It's like
Hmm.
it's ingrained all the way down to what we teach our kids.
It is. Oh, it definitely is. I remember, I've taught in multiple schools around the DC area, but I remember in DC specifically, I was teaching go-go. Ooh, Lord.
Yeah,
And
of
there's like
course.
a whole
Yeah.
thing happening with go-go here. I had a principal come into my classroom and said, stop teaching that noise. She
Oh my
literally said that in front of
goodness.
me, in front of the kids. I said, what are you talking about? This is noise.
Now for
No,
the
this is go-go. This is what the students listen to every day. This is not noise, and I can incorporate this in this, and this, and this. So the fact that you're calling it noise is almost disrespectful to not only me, but to the students and to their families, because this
and
is a part of the culture here.
right, that's what I was going to say, and to the local culture. For the people who don't
Right.
know, talk a little bit about what go-go is. It's a specific style of
Ooh.
hip hop, right?
Yes. Well, it's a specific style of funk. So, um, Chuck Brown used to play like backup and background. This might not be I'm not the historian behind go-go, but this is
Right,
what I know of
right.
go-go. So anybody, please feel free to correct me. But Chuck Brown used to play like backup to like James Brown, and like during James Brown's set, he would like walk off, and there would be an opportunity for like intermission music. And what they would do is they would play around with the music, and it ended up being like this really dope like funk jam with a focus on like the percussion section.
Yeah.
And it would have this pocket, which would be like boom, 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 boom. So it was really interesting. I'm probably not even singing it right, but it was like this really like interesting funk beat, and then that eventually became like go-go music.
Right.
So it was at one point it was just intermission music for funk music. But now it's like they've come up with songs like, so if you listen to like Doing the Butt, that's go-go music.
Yeah.
More modern music, I would say like what's that song by Kelly Rowland? Like This, which
Yeah.
came out a couple of years ago. That was go-go. A. Marie's Just One Thing, that was go-go. So you hear like a little focus on like the Congos. And now like they have different bands, which is like Backyard Band, Rare Essence, EU. So it's like a whole history here. This is probably about 30, 40 years old within this area alone. And so there's a lot of history that goes with that. Like it's very fluid in DC. And so what's going on here in DC now is that because of all the gentrification that's going on, DC was known for street musicians. So there would be like little kids, or there'd be kids or like up and coming artists, musicians on the corners playing go-go music, just like having fun, give a dollar here, give a dollar there while
Yeah.
they're making the music. So now that gentrification is happening, people are moving into these neighborhoods where they were predominantly commercial areas where most of the street musicians were, because in the commercial areas, that's where you can find most of the foot traffic where people are
Right.
walking. And now they're
Right.
complaining and saying that the music is bothering them, that they can't go to sleep, blah, 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 blah. But once again, who gets condos in commercial areas? That's a whole different story. But they're like calling police on musicians, and police were like giving cites and citations. And then at one point, there's a famous corner on Florida and Georgia Avenue where there was a T-Mobile store, and that T-Mobile store used to have like a huge speaker on the corner, and they used to just blast go-go music, and then people would walk by and dance and all the other stuff. So they built this new condo building about half a block up, and someone from that condo building called the T-Mobile store's national headquarters, and then T-Mobile called that store and told them to stop playing the music. So one day people are walking by and they're like, "Where's the music?" And they're like, "Well, national headquarters said we've been getting complaints about this music that we've been putting on this corner for like 20 plus years." And so it created like this whole uprising of like, you all are trying to move into the city and telling us to be quiet, basically. So they came up with this whole hashtag called Don't Mute DC, and basically saying don't mute the music, don't mute the culture that's already been here, pay respect to the culture, honor the culture. And they had this whole concert called Mochella, which took up like the entire U Street area. And it's basically a pushback to all of the gentrification and to all the people who have been um, disrespectful to the culture that's been here.
Man, it's like you have to fight for the validation of this music and this culture in the classroom, in the
Right,
streets, and everywhere where it existed. It's not like go-go music and everything you were trying to teach in your classroom came from the outside. It existed there, and you're trying to
right.
cultivate it. And there's a fight to destroy it. It again. It reminds me of the first part of our conversation talking about indigenous people and their
Right.
culture and maintaining. Who, goodness gracious, there's something else.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so all of these efforts, I guess, led you to being an arts administrator. How was that transition from going from the classroom to going to like the offices? And before you even talk about that, I'm sure there are a lot of people that have never heard of an arts administrator or the field of arts administration. In a nutshell, what is that?
Yeah, so an arts administrator is basically the people who are behind the scenes of an arts organization. So if you're at a symphony orchestra concert, an arts administrator can be anybody who runs the box office to someone who does fundraising and development for that organization, to someone who does all of the education programs, so like an education director, anybody who does the behind the scenes of an arts organization. Um, yeah, and so those are the people who actually keep the organizations running. So I think arts administration didn't become popular until about 30 to 40 years ago. And I think they started coming out with higher education programs focused in arts administration probably in the 1960s, 1970s. I think American University might have been one of the first arts administrators or arts
Okay.
management programs. But yeah, those are the people who keep arts organizations running.
So how did you go from the classroom to arts administration?
That's funny. So that's a really interesting question because I didn't really technically go from the classroom until arts administration until about 6 months ago.
Oh wow. Okay.
But I did get my degree in 2016, my second master's degree in arts management from American University. And during that time, I had a fellowship at the National PTA, who has an arts education program. And so I was helping run that program. So behind the scenes, again, helping run a national association's arts education program. And then from there, once I graduated from the program, I was like, oh, I had all these connections. American University has a plethora of connections and alumni globally. But I kept ending up in spaces where there were a lack of people of color, and there were a lot of conversations happening about community engagement and how to engage communities of color. And then I would often be the only one in that, like in those
Of
conversations.
color.
And so, right. And so they would all like point to me, like, you're here. How do we do this, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
I was like, well, I can't speak for all people of color. Like, I can't do that. That's not something I could do. And so one day I was talking to Ariel Shelton, who's now a board member, but she also went to Howard University
Yeah,
with
shout
me.
out to Ariel.
Uh,
Yeah.
and she and I were like, wouldn't it be really dope to get a bunch of arts administrators of color in the same space. So I ended up creating the organization Arts Administrators of Color Network, did all the paperwork and all the background, 501c3, charitable donation, and we've been kind of trying to push all of this diversity, equity, and inclusion work forward for the past 3 years. So we've had over 30 events, and we have about 1,200 members in the DC, Maryland, Virginia area. We also have people who are outside of the area who we consider as members. We're working on building up capacity now to create chapters in different cities. And then we've also seen that there's people who are creating similar organizations, which we love when people create similar organizations in other cities as well. So our focus is to basically provide like our own professional development and leadership opportunities for people of color in the arts. So regardless of it being an artist or an arts administrator.
I want to connect your time as a classroom teacher to your role as an arts administrator. How do you think arts administrators can sort of influence curriculums and make sure what's taught in the classroom is more culturally competent and ways to prevent school administrators from coming in the classroom and telling teachers to turn off that noise, or just how can arts administrators validate the culture and the arts of people of color that already exist in these communities.
Right. And I think the fundamental part of being an arts administrator is that you have to be well connected into the community. Like you have to do things outside of your job description. You literally have to, like, if you need to serve, if you're an education person as a administrator, if you're working in an organization as an arts education person, you should be serving on education committee of your local school district that you serve. Like you need to be a part of those conversations to ensure that there's advocacy in the arts that's happening, because like the supervisors and coordinators of arts education within the public school systems can only do but so much, and it's only usually one person, and they're overseeing K-12 all disciplines, which is difficult for them to advocate. So having those additional voices at the table is definitely helpful for them. So my transition from being a teacher, I ended up actually becoming the director of learning and leadership development at the National Guild for Community Arts Education. And what they do is they're not so much in the classroom; they're more so in like the community arts field, which is like after school or like pull in arts residency programs or teaching artists and all that other stuff. But they're very vocal in talking about like what a competent arts leader or arts administrator looks like in the field and what their background should be. And they always focus on like how culture and race should be at the epicenter of being a great leader in this field. And so I'm actually transitioning from that position now to lead an arts education advocacy organization in Maryland. And so I already am signed up for the Maryland Education Council, and I'm working closely with the Maryland State Department of Education's coordinator of fine arts, who oversees all the curriculum. I'm working with the Maryland State Arts Council, where they have a lot of arts education funding. So it's you have to put your tentacles into all of that work, but you also have to be very dedicated into that work. If you're not dedicated into that arts, if you're not dedicated into making change in arts ed, then you shouldn't be in arts ed, right?
Right.
Arts ed can't be the same old, same old. We can't keep teaching the same old anymore. Our schools are becoming too racially and culturally diverse. Our students are dealing with a lot more than what they've been dealing with. I remember when I was teaching in Montgomery County, a lot of my students were first generation Americans, and when the whole ICE thing, which is still going on, was beginning to start, they were afraid to come to school because they didn't know whether or not they would go home and their family would be gone.
Oh my goodness.
These are things that we need to address in the arts education world. We have to start speaking up for our students and ensuring that they're getting a high quality arts education, but then also acknowledging that arts education is a civil right. So this is something that I'm learning. There's a guy named Amir Whitaker in California who's actually suing, I believe he's suing the federal government and the state of California. If I'm not correct, just let me know. Because arts education is inequitable within the state of California. And we all know that if students don't have access to arts education, they know later down the line there are other things that pop up within, like academic achievement, opportunity gaps. We know that the school to prison pipeline gets activated in certain points, and so we understand that arts education is a vital piece for that. And so one of the things that he speaks about is how arts education is a civil right for all students, no matter where you are. And if the school is not providing high quality arts education, then you are disrupting that student's civil right, and you should be there should be consequences for that.
Right, and as some of my predecessors who came up as Black Panthers and all that would say, that's violent. That's violence.
It is. It is violent.
To keep that from those students. And when I think about arts education that's culturally competent, I think about students going to school and seeing themselves and their culture reflected, and that validating the rest of their lives. Not that they need
Right.
validation from the schools, but it's definitely significant for them to be able to go to school and see themselves in their education. Not just when we talk about American history and when we talk about language arts, but the fine arts, and making sure
Right.
that is addressed.
Right.
So how can people, do you need an arts administration degree or background to kind of engage some of these community initiatives? How can people find ways to be a part of this work in their own communities?
Yeah, you don't need an arts admin degree. I don't. They're probably going to hate me for saying that, but you don't really need
And I'm
it.
sure it helps.
It helps, and it puts you in the right like connections, and it connects you to the right people. But you can also do that yourself. It might take a little bit more focus and a little bit more discipline, but you can definitely do the work yourself to get more involved. Um, yeah, because I love the program that I went through, but then also debt, right?
Of course, yeah, and that's a whole
And
nother
so
thing.
if I could encourage people to not have debt, I will.
Yeah, yeah. Now, how can people find out more about you and the work that you do specifically on the East Coast and elsewhere, as far as cultural competency and arts administration?
Sure. They can look up our website. Arts Administrators of Color Network is www.aacnetwork.org. And then you can look at all of our programs that we have coming up. So we have an annual convening for anybody who's listening. The annual convening is formed by people of color in the arts. So you can be an arts leader, you can be an artist, you can be an arts administrator, anybody who works in the arts and creative field. And it's going to be here in Washington, D.C., November 9th and 10th. So this is our biggest event as of yet, because this is the first time we're having a 2-day convening instead of a 1-day convening. So we're really excited about that. We're expecting over 300 people, mostly based in DC, but we do have a lot of people who come from Philly, from Cleveland, from Atlanta. It's a really dope space. Like I consider it a family reunion because we get to see each other
Yeah,
and talk to
yeah,
each other
yeah.
and meet each other and party together. So if you're really interested, feel free to reach out on our website, or you can email me at qgfloyd@gmail.com.
And then one more time, could you give the information, sort of the details about, again, your Art Accordingly podcast?
Oh yeah, so one of the programs that we have for Arts Administrators of Color Network is Art Accordingly, and so what Joshua, who's my co-host, and I do is we examine and analyze and basically like read any like organizations who are going through diversity, equity, inclusion issues, and we're just reading the field in general, but we're also providing calls to action so that we can all move forward together in this journey to liberation in the arts world.
Absolutely. Well, Quanice, thank you so much for talking with me. Thank you for the work you do.
No, thank you so much. Thank you for the work you do. I really appreciate it. You're amazing. Love you.
Oh, well, thank you.
Quanice Floyd in conversation with Garrett McQueen here on TRILLOQUY. You ready to talk about some go-go?
Doing the butt? Surely you played that at a party or two.
I did, yeah. And Bustin' Loose, Nelly used that was a
Yeah.
lift right there, almost
Yeah.
exactly. So
Yeah, a very important, subgenre of funk, as Quanice said, and one that deserves a place in the classroom. One of my big takeaways from what Quanice was talking about was when she said arts administrators have to be well connected to their communities. And oh my goodness, like when I think about a lot of these orchestras, are those arts administrators in those organizations well connected with those communities? I don't think so. And maybe I'm misstepping by saying that, but it doesn't feel like that to me.
That's what I was going to say. It doesn't feel like it.
When you consider programming and when you consider that sort of thing, it just does not feel like it. And that's the next big step that these organizations need to take. And I have to bring up the Minnesota Orchestra again. They have to be well connected with that community to engage the community. And they take for granted that there's such this large organization that will always have the financial support, that will always have the audience there. But what is it worth if the community that you reside in doesn't know anything about you or doesn't feel engaged or included in what you're doing?
Well, then you feel shut out, right?
Right,
I mean,
exactly.
exclusion is there, even though you have a big stake in the history of the environment of the region.
Yeah, yeah. But again, I just really appreciate Quanice for what she does as far as the conversations concerning indigenous people, because so many of these, I thought she made a really great point in connecting protest music with what was she talking about? Protest music with the Revolutionary War, and then
Right.
I thought about the Boston Tea Party, which what they don't teach you in school is that those folks were dressed up as indigenous people, painted themselves red and had
Right.
feathers sticking out of their heads and stuff. The relationship between I'm just going to say white people and indigenous people has been troubled over so long, and I hope that in the future some of those stories and some of those lessons taught to the youngsters will be a little more truthful and a little more equitable. Did you ever see the movie Pocahontas?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, there was. I think I was in second or third grade when that movie came out, and there's a line from the movie that I never forgot about. I hope I can.
These white men are dangerous. These white
Whoa.
men are
I'm sitting right here.
But that was Disney sort of shouting out and laying out the perspective of some of those people. They were here minding their own business, and John Smith and crew come to take all what they thought it was a lot of gold here and all that anyway.
Right. Let me tell you, if you read like the first 5 pages of A People's History of the United States, you will be ready to upend tables, and it will make you angry.
Yeah.
Yeah, start there if you're looking for a spot.
Yeah. So again, big shout outs to Quanice for sitting down with me. She's doing some incredible work, and I hope to sit down with her again soon. I usually see her about 2 or 3 times a year, so looking forward to our next conversation.
Speaking of next conversations, next time on Triloquy.
Next time on Triloquy, I'm so excited, Scott. I can barely contain myself. The next opus of Triloquy is a Beyonce episode. It's not strictly a Beyonce episode, but I talked to my great homegirl, Jessica Majunkins, who works in New York City as a music contractor. So we talk a lot about contracting and what that work is. She's a violinist, and how her career led her to performing with Beyonce at Homecoming at Coachella, and which was followed by going on tour with Beyonce on the On the Run tour too. We talk about Beyonce. We talk about the implications of a celebrity like Beyonce validating classical musicians by putting string players on the stage, on a stage like that.
Nice.
And everything around it. I'm so excited. I cannot wait to spend the next opus of Triloquy exploring my friend Jessica Majunkins, her connections to Beyonce, and everything in between.
And don't forget, our website is live. It's TRILLOQUY.org. And you can even make contact. Just email us at triloquy@americanpublicmedia.org.